I thought walking into an affair was bad enough, but those sandals at the bottom of my staircase were just the smallest piece of a massive trap built on debt, forged title deeds, and a betrayal so cold it felt clinical. While they thought they were sneaking around behind my back, I saw exactly what they truly wanted. They did not just want my husband. They wanted the entire life I had built, every single square foot of it. My name is Avery Barnes. I am 37 years old, and for the past decade, I have made my living dissecting lies. As a senior fraud investigator for Vesper Risk Solutions, right here in Charlotte, North Carolina, my daily bread consists of finding the hidden threads in offshore accounts, fabricated ledgers, and the tiny, arrogant mistakes that guilty people always make. I track discrepancies for a living. I look for the things that do not belong. I should have known better than to think my own home was immune to them. The conference in Phoenix had imploded in a mess of scheduling conflicts and a sudden keynote cancellation. Instead of wasting 48 hours in a sun-baked desert hotel, I booked the first red-eye back to the East Coast, arriving exactly 2 days earlier than my original itinerary dictated. The drive from Charlotte Douglas International was a blur of exhaustion and quiet anticipation. I had a vision of how the morning would go. I would slip my key into the lock, leave my bags in the foyer, and crawl into the warm sheets beside my husband, Bennett Cross. We had been married for 7 years. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted that soft, sleepy smile he gave me when he woke up to find me there, the heavy weight of his arm pulling me close against his chest. I turned the key in the front door with practiced silence. The brass hinges, which Bennett had just oiled over the weekend, did not make a single sound as the heavy wood swung inward. The house was bathed in the pale, muted light of early morning. The air conditioning hummed its familiar, steady rhythm, pushing cool air through the vents I had paid to upgrade just last spring. Everything felt perfect, peaceful, deeply mine. Then I looked down. Right at the bottom of the custom oak staircase, resting casually against the pristine white baseboard, was a pair of shoes. They were champagne-colored sandals with needle-thin stiletto heels and delicate, crisscrossing ankle straps. They were definitely not mine. I do not wear champagne stilettos, certainly not the kind that cost more than a monthly car payment. They were positioned with the careless, kicked-off elegance of someone who felt entirely at home. My brain, trained by years of rigorous corporate investigation to recognize patterns and catalog evidence, immediately matched the shoes to a face: Tessa Wren. She was a high-end luxury real estate broker, the kind of woman who wore immaculate silk blouses to dusty construction sites and always smelled vaguely of expensive bergamot and generational wealth. She was also the primary listing agent who frequently orbited Bennett's boutique home renovation projects. I had seen those exact sandals on her feet at a charity gala just 3 weeks ago, watching as she clinked glasses with my husband and discussed market trends. I stood absolutely frozen on the hardwood floor. The handle of my rolling suitcase was still gripped tightly in my right hand, my knuckles turning white. Above me, the floorboards of the master suite creaked, a heavy, rhythmic shifting of weight. Then came the laugh. It drifted down the open, sweeping stairwell. It was a low, throaty, deeply relaxed sound. It was the laugh of a woman who was stretched out under the covers, completely bare, completely satisfied, and completely unaware that the legal owner of the house was standing directly beneath her. It was a sound so intimate, so inherently violating in the center of my private sanctuary, that the breath physically left my lungs. Following the laugh, I heard the low, resonant baritone of my husband, the voice that had vowed to protect me, the voice that had whispered into my hair on our wedding day, the voice that had promised me forever. "Relax," Bennett said, his words floating down the stairs with a sickening, casual clarity. "She doesn't land until Thursday." The words hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. My stomach seized, flash freezing into a solid block of ice. The blood drained from my face, rushing out of my extremities until my fingertips felt entirely numb. In that singular, stretching second, the instinct of a betrayed wife screamed at me to drop the suitcase. It told me to march up those 22 carpeted steps, throw open the heavy mahogany door, and scream until my vocal cords shredded. I wanted to shatter the illusion, to break glass, to drag Tessa out of my bed by her perfectly highlighted hair. I wanted to see the terror in Bennett's eyes when he realized his world was crashing down. But the wife did not take the next step. The investigator did, because screaming is a loss of control. Screaming gives them the power of a reaction, the ability to frame you as the hysterical, unhinged spouse. And if there is one thing I have learned from interrogating embezzlers and corporate thieves, it is that the moment you let them know you are onto them without securing your evidence first, they will spin, deny, and destroy everything in their path to save themselves. I lowered the handle of my rolling suitcase. I did not drop it. I guided it down until it rested silently against the hallway wall. I reached into my trench coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I silenced the device, double-checking that the camera flash and shutter sound were completely disabled. I walked over to the staircase, my footsteps lighter than air. I framed the champagne sandals perfectly within the digital viewfinder, ensuring the bottom stair and the distinctive geometric pattern of our Persian runner were visible for spatial context. I tapped the screen. The image captured perfectly. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the immediate area with cold, clinical precision. There were faint, damp indentations on the edge of the wool rug, the unmistakable footprints from someone who had kicked off their shoes in a hurried frenzy. I photographed them. I moved silently past the stairs and toward the kitchen. Draped carelessly over the carved wooden banister in the hallway was a light coat, a woman's coat, beige, tailored, smelling faintly of that signature bergamot. I captured the label, the drape, the position of the garment. In the kitchen, sitting on the sprawling marble island Bennett had so proudly installed last year using funds from our joint savings, were 2 wine glasses. One was nearly empty, stained with a faint crescent of rose-colored lipstick on the delicate rim. The other was half full. Beside them lay an open bottle of a vintage red Bordeaux we had specifically been saving for our upcoming anniversary. I documented the glasses, the bottle, the lipstick stain. I captured the timeline of their evening, the undeniable forensic trail of 2 people who believed they were untouchable in my territory. My pulse was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my throat, a physical manifestation of the heartbreak trying to tear its way out, but my hands were completely steady. The adrenaline was no longer fueling panic, it was fueling a cold, hyper-focused clarity. The emotional devastation was certainly there, a massive, crushing weight waiting for me in the dark, but I took that weight and locked it away in a mental vault. I could not afford to grieve right now. Grief was for later. Right now, I had a job to do. I turned my back on the staircase and the soft, murmuring voices now drifting from the master bedroom. I walked down the hall and let myself into my private home office, easing the heavy door shut and engaging the brass lock with a soft, barely audible click. The room smelled of old paper, leather binders, and my own perfume. It was my sanctuary, the place where I unraveled the deception of others. I sat down at my heavy oak desk. Flipping open the lid of my laptop, the screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across my face. I placed my hands flat on the cool surface of the desk and closed my eyes. I took one deep, measured breath in through my nose, holding it for 4 seconds, and exhaled slowly through my mouth. It was the exact breathing exercise I used before walking into a conference room to confront a CEO who had just defrauded his investors out of millions. Bennett and Tessa thought they were playing a clever little game. They thought they had until Thursday, but they had made the fatal mistake of playing their game on my board, under my roof, and leaving their literal footprints on my floor. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, my mind already organizing data, timelines, and legal precedents. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to myself right then and there. The ending of this story would absolutely not belong to the 2 people upstairs. The glow of the dual monitors was the only light I allowed in my office. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with the rigid muscle memory precision of a surgeon opening a chest cavity. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger is a messy, chaotic emotion that clouds judgment and leaves traces. I needed cold, hard data. I started with the digital perimeter of the house. I logged into the administrative portal of our mesh Wi-Fi network. Bennett had insisted on installing the highest tier system last year to support his massive rendering software, leaving the default administrator password exactly as I had set it. I pulled the historical connection logs. It took me less than 4 minutes to isolate a recurring, unfamiliar media access control address. I cross-referenced the device fingerprint. It was registered simply as Tessa iPhone. I filtered the data by date. She had not just been here today. Her device had automatically authenticated and joined our private network on 14 distinct Wednesdays over the past 3 months. 14 times she had walked through my front door, comfortable enough to let her phone sync to my router. Next, I accessed the cloud dashboard of our home security system. I pulled up the event history, downloading the raw spreadsheet. I noticed a glaring, repeated anomaly. The motion sensors on the second floor, specifically the master bedroom and the upstairs hallway, had been manually bypassed from the main keypad. I aligned these bypass timestamps with my own corporate travel calendar. Without a single exception, the second-floor sensors were only disabled on the exact days I was scanning my boarding passes at the airport for out-of-state fraud conferences. They had automated their deception down to the minute. But affairs are common. Affairs are boring. I investigate white-collar crime, and in my world, when people get comfortable sneaking around, they start cutting corners in other areas. I opened the application utility for our heavy-duty laser printer, the one sitting just 3 feet away from my desk. The machine keeps a local spooling log of the last 500 printed documents. I scrolled through Bennett's endless architectural drafts and permit applications until the titles of the files began to shift. 2 weeks ago, someone had printed a copy of our original property deed. 4 days after that, a county property tax record. Then, a topographical boundary survey of our exact parcel. I stared at the screen, the silence of the house suddenly feeling very heavy. Why would Bennett need a physical copy of a boundary survey for a property we had occupied for 7 full years? You only pull a boundary survey when you are preparing to alter the lot lines, sell the property, or leverage the land. I opened a new tab and logged into my personal email. I bypassed the inbox and went straight to the deleted items folder, then directly to the filtered spam. There, buried under promotional emails from clothing stores, was an automated notification from DocuSign. It was dated 12 days ago. The subject line read, Home Equity, Line of Credit Review. The sender was a loan officer at a mid-sized regional bank we had never done business with. I clicked the secure link. The system showed the document envelope as completed. It contained a 70-page application for a massive equity draw against our house, requesting exactly 85% of the total appraised value. At the bottom of the final page, right next to Bennett's signature, was a flawless digital reproduction of my own signature. I had never opened this email. I had never seen this document. I certainly had never signed it. I leaned back in my leather executive chair. The air in the room felt distinctly thinner. My husband had forged my signature to pull equity out of our primary residence. Why would he take such a massive, reckless, federal-level risk? I opened the shared cloud drive for his business, Cross and Vale Living. Bennett always told me the company was thriving, pulling in high-end clients from all over the county. Cash flow is solid, he had told me just last Friday over dinner. I bypassed the marketing folders and went straight into the accounts payable directory. It was a complete financial bloodbath. I found 3 demand letters from his primary lumber supplier, all past 90 days due. I found mechanics liens threatened by independent electrical contractors. His general liability insurance was pending cancellation for non-payment. The business was not thriving. It was actively suffocating, drowning in high-interest short-term debt. He needed cash, desperately, and he was trying to use the roof over my head to get it. But how did Tessa fit into the financial side of this equation? She was a luxury real estate broker, not a commercial loan officer. I opened the multiple listing service database, using my corporate investigative access to bypass the public filters and see the raw broker notes. I searched for Tessa Wren's active and recently pending transactions. She usually handled turnkey mansions in the northern suburbs, but her recent activity showed a sharp, uncharacteristic pivot. She had recently secured the listings for 3 dilapidated, single-story homes. I dropped the addresses into a digital mapping tool. A red pin dropped for each property. They formed a neat, tight semicircle. I typed my own home address into the search bar and hit enter. A 4th red pin dropped, landing dead center, perfectly connecting the other 3 properties into a massive, contiguous block of land. My heart gave a slow, hard thump against my ribs. I zoomed out on the map. We lived in the South End corridor. For the past 6 months, there had been quiet, unconfirmed whispers in the city planning commissions about a proposed extension of the light rail system. If the transit line came through here, single-family zoning would be wiped out. A contiguous block of land like the one Tessa was assembling would see a 300% increase in value overnight to a commercial developer looking to build a high-density transit hub. I opened a blank spreadsheet. It was time to build the timeline. In column A, I typed out the dates of my business trips over the last 90 days. In column B, I entered the exact times Tessa's phone connected to my Wi-Fi. Column C held the timestamps of the bypassed security sensors. Column D recorded the exact hour the property deeds and boundary surveys were printed. In column E, I listed the dates Bennett had put on our shared calendar as late-night client dinners. Finally, in column F, I added the dates Tessa secured the listings for the 3 neighboring properties. I highlighted the rows and ran a simple sorting algorithm. The data aligned with terrifying, absolute perfection. Every time I boarded a plane, Tessa walked into my house. While they were upstairs, Bennett was downstairs printing my property documents. The day after Tessa secured the 3rd neighboring lot, Bennett initiated the fraudulent home equity loan to get the cash they presumably needed to buy me out or force a sale. I sat in the cold glow of the monitors, the digital evidence staring back at me. The sickness in my stomach was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline focus. This was not a mistake. This was not a crime of passion, a momentary lapse in judgment, or a husband seeking comfort in the arms of another woman because he felt neglected. The champagne sandals, the half-empty glasses of wine, the hushed laughter floating down the staircase were all just the operational cover. The affair was entirely real, but it was secondary. It was an affair, but it also served as cover for a calculated, multi-million-dollar real estate conspiracy. They were not just sleeping together in my bed. They were conducting a hostile takeover of my financial existence. They were using my blind trust, my grueling travel schedule, and the very foundation of my home to build their own empire. They thought I was just a wife who would cry, pack a bag, and hire a divorce attorney who would settle for half the savings account. They did not realize they had just invited a senior corporate fraud investigator to dissect their lives. I closed the spreadsheet, saving it to a secure, encrypted flash drive. I was going to tear their entire world apart, brick by stolen brick. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the portal for our joint personal checking account. If Bennett was bleeding his business dry, I needed to see if the infection had spread to our shared assets. I bypassed the standard dashboard and downloaded the raw comma-separated values file for the past 12 months. I did not want a summarized pie chart. I wanted the bare, unvarnished transaction data. I imported the file into my spreadsheet and began filtering out the daily noise of groceries, utility bills, and gas station charges. I isolated all outbound wire transfers, certified checks, and anomalous point-of-sale debits. The pattern emerged almost instantly, forming a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight into a financial abyss. 3 months ago, there was a charge for $450 to a commercial title research firm. 2 weeks later, an outbound wire of $625 went to an independent property appraiser. But the most damning line item was a seemingly innocuous state filing fee for $300. I cross-referenced the vendor identification code. It was the standard fee paid to the Secretary of State for the formation of a limited liability company. The memo line on the bank ledger contained a fragmented string of text, but I could clearly make out the name Juniper Crest Holdings. They had formed a corporate shell. I needed to know how deep the communication went. I minimized the spreadsheet and opened the local mail client on our shared home desktop. Bennett used this machine for his heavy architectural rendering, but he also synced his personal email here for convenience. I clicked into his drafts folder. Careless people always use the drafts folder as a digital notepad. There was an unsent message created 5 days ago, with no recipient listed. It was not a letter. It was a holding pen for copied texts and notes, a checklist Bennett was clearly using to keep his complex web of lies organized. I scrolled down the page, the glow of the screen burning into my eyes. My gaze locked onto a pasted string of text, clearly copied from a messaging app. The syntax and tone were undeniably Tessa. Just hold off. The pasted text read, "Make sure you let her sign after the reconciliation weekend. She will be more compliant when she feels guilty for doubting you." A reconciliation weekend. My lungs felt tight, as if the oxygen in my office had suddenly turned to ash. Bennett had booked a surprise 2-night stay at a vineyard in the Blue Ridge Mountains for late next month, claiming we needed to reconnect because my work schedule had been so demanding. He had manufactured a fake marital crisis, planned a fake romantic getaway to solve it, and intended to use the resulting emotional high to slip a fraudulent financial document under my pen. But the next pasted note in the draft was what truly stopped me cold. It was a copied text message from a different number. I recognized the phrasing immediately. It was Judith Cross, my mother-in-law, the woman who had given me her grandmother's pearl earrings on my wedding day and held my hand during the holidays. "The house part will be fine if Avery thinks this is just about you two." Judith had written to her son, "Keep the focus on the affair if she catches on. A heartbroken wife walks away from the property. A suspicious wife hires a forensic accountant. Do not let her see the land deals." A physical wave of nausea rolled through me. I gripped the edge of my heavy oak desk to anchor myself. This was not a passive cover-up. Judith was the tactical advisor. She knew her son was sleeping with Tessa Wren, and she was actively instructing him to use his own infidelity as a smokescreen. I forced myself to breathe. I needed to isolate the forgery. I pulled up the fraudulent DocuSign application I had found in my spam folder. I zoomed in to 400% on the final page, scrutinizing the pixels around my purported signature. It was too perfect. Real signatures vary, affected by the angle of the pen and the texture of the paper. This signature was a static, flattened image. I opened my personal archive of scanned documents and began a visual comparison. It took me 20 minutes to find the exact match. It was from a silent auction donation form I had signed for a children's charity gala last November. The slight drag on the tail of the letter Y, the specific loop of the letter B, it was an identical pixel-for-pixel match. Bennett had lifted the high-resolution scan, isolated the ink path using his architectural design software, and dropped it onto a federal banking document. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Marisol Kent. She was not just my personal attorney, she was a ruthless litigator who specialized in high-stakes asset protection. "Avery," Marisol answered on the second ring. "It is early. Tell me you are calling with good news." "I need you to pull the state corporate registry for an entity called Juniper Crest Holdings," I said, my voice eerily calm, stripped of all emotion. "I need the registered agent, the operating agreement if it is public, and a list of all real property tied to that LLC. I also need to prepare a dispute of unauthorized encumbrance for my primary residence." I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Give me 10 minutes, Marisol said, immediately shifting into war mode. "Do not confront anyone yet." As soon as I disconnected, I called the corporate hotline for North Spire Bank. I bypassed the standard customer service tree, using my credentials as a fraud investigator to get transferred directly to their internal risk management liaison. "My name is Avery Barnes," I told the liaison, reading off the application number from the PDF. "I am the primary title holder on the property listed in this home equity application. I am officially notifying you that the signature on page 70 is a digital forgery. I have not authorized this line of credit. The typing on the other end was frantic. Ms.
Barnes, let me freeze the file immediately, the liaison said, his tone tight with corporate liability panic. Looking at the system now, the loan has not been disbursed. It is sitting in final pre-approval.
We were literally just waiting on one final, physically notarized page to release the funds. The requested draw is for $850,000. I ended the call and set the phone down. $850,000. 10 minutes later, an encrypted email arrived from Marisol. I opened the attached dossier on Juniper Crest Holdings. The LLC was registered out of a post office box, but the managing members were listed clear as day: Bennett Cross and Tessa Wren. I scrolled to the property holdings. Juniper Crest Holdings had already executed quiet, off-market purchase agreements for the 3 dilapidated lots surrounding my house. But those 3 lots were narrow, irregularly shaped, and lacked direct access to the main commercial avenue. They were virtually worthless for major commercial development on their own. Then I looked at the county plat map Marisol had attached. My property, the home I had paid the mortgage on for 7 years, sat directly on the corner. It was a massive, perfectly rectangular double lot that anchored the entire block. It was the only parcel that provided the necessary frontage and alleyway access required by city zoning laws for high-density construction. The final, suffocating layer of the truth snapped into place, tightening around my throat like a snare. My house was the keystone. Without my lot, their 3 properties were just a bad investment. With my lot, the entire 4-parcel block could be leveled and sold to the light rail developers for tens of millions of dollars. They needed my land to complete the puzzle. But they could not simply offer to buy me out, because I would investigate the sudden interest, discover the transit expansion plans, and demand the commercial value. So they devised a different strategy. They decided to break me. They were using the affair to orchestrate a catastrophic emotional collapse. They wanted me to walk in on them, or find a staged piece of evidence, and completely shatter. They banked on the cliché that a betrayed, devastated wife would be so blinded by heartbreak and humiliation that she would just want out. They expected me to sign away my rights to the marital home in a swift, agonizing divorce settlement, desperate to escape the memories of the bed they had defiled. Tessa was not just stealing my husband. Bennett was not just cheating on his wife. Judith was not just protecting her son. They had weaponized my marriage, turning love and trust into tactical instruments to execute a multi-million-dollar real estate heist. They thought they had trapped me in an emotional cage, unaware that I now held the blueprints to the lock. I stepped out of my private office and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. My movements were deliberate, unhurried, and grounded in a terrifying, absolute certainty. I reached into the upper cabinet, pulled down my favorite heavy ceramic mug, and placed a fresh pod into the espresso machine. The low grinding hum of the brewer was the only sound in the house, a steady vibration that mirrored the newly hardened, rhythmic thumping of my pulse. I poured a splash of cold almond milk into the dark liquid, stirred it exactly 2 times, and leaned back against the cool edge of the marble island. I knew I would not have to wait very long. The thick oak floorboards of the upper hallway groaned a soft warning. Then came the unmistakable sound of 2 people descending the stairs. They were speaking in hushed, intimate murmurs, completely wrapped in the arrogant, fragile bubble of their presumed secrecy. Bennett stepped into the visual frame of the kitchen first, casually adjusting the collar of his wrinkled linen shirt. Tessa was trailing just a half step behind him, running a manicured hand through her perfectly tousled hair. A deeply satisfied, lazy smile rested comfortably on her face. Bennett looked up, his eyes locked onto mine across the expanse of the kitchen. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violent. His forward momentum stopped so abruptly that Tessa stumbled right into his broad shoulder. The color drained from his face in an instant, leaving his skin a sickly gray. His jaw dropped open, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Tessa peered around his arm, her lazy smile instantly shattering into a mask of pure shock. They looked exactly like 2 people caught in the sudden, blinding beam of a high-powered searchlight. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee. The ceramic was warm and comforting against my palms. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the mug. I looked directly past my husband, focusing my gaze entirely on the woman standing frozen on the bottom step. "Why are your champagne sandals sitting at the bottom of my staircase?" I asked. The question hung in the ambient air, incredibly light but razor sharp, slicing cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Bennett finally found his breath. It came out of his lungs in a panicked, ragged gasp. He stepped forward, instinctively raising both of his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, as if trying to physically push back the reality of the situation. "Avery," he stammered, his voice cracking pitifully on the second syllable of my name. "Avery, wait. Please, just listen to me. Let me explain. This is not what it looks like at all. Well, it is. But it is not what you think. It was a massive mistake, a terrible, emotional mistake. Things have been so difficult and stressful lately, and we just got caught up in a moment of utter weakness." I let him talk. I stood perfectly still and watched the man I had married shrink into a pathetic, sweating caricature of himself. He was desperately trying to control the narrative of the morning, forcefully framing the catastrophe as a simple, tragic failure of marital fidelity. He wanted me to believe this was a spontaneous collapse of morals, a private, messy tragedy born from neglect and loneliness. I gave him room to keep talking, and he used it to make his situation worse. I did not say a single word about the boundary surveys I knew he had printed. I did not mention the forged loan applications sitting in the bank queue, or the corporate shell company they had secretly registered. I kept the real financial evidence hidden, letting him believe that the affair was the worst thing I had discovered. When his frantic, babbling excuses finally sputtered to a dry halt, I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. The sharp, decisive clink of the ceramic against the stone made both of them flinch visibly. "You have 48 hours, I said, my voice flat and emotionless. Bennett blinked rapidly, clearly disoriented by my absolute lack of hysteria. 48 hours for what? To remove your personal clothing and your basic toiletries from this property, I replied smoothly. You will pack your bags, and you will both leave. If you are still inside these walls when that clock expires, I will have the local authorities physically remove you for trespassing." Tessa, finally recovering a small fraction of her usual high society arrogance, stepped out from the shadow of my husband. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to project a flimsy facade of professional authority. "Avery, let us all just take a deep breath," Tessa said, her tone dripping with a sickening, practiced empathy. "There is obviously a lot of raw emotion right now, but legally speaking, this is Bennett's primary residence too. You cannot just kick him out onto the street on a moment's notice without proper legal documentation." I shifted my gaze back to her. I let the silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the weight of my stare press down on her chest before I finally spoke. "I am not asking you to leave, Tessa," I said quietly. "I am instructing you. And while you and my soon-to-be ex-husband are packing your casual wear, you will listen to me very carefully. You will not touch a single piece of paper in this house. You will not open a filing cabinet. You will not log into the desktop computer in the study. Every document, every printed sheet, every digital file under this roof is now considered potential evidence." Tessa's arrogant posture evaporated instantly. The word evidence hit her like a physical strike to the face. The faint, flushed blush of her recent activities vanished entirely, replaced by a stark, terrified pallor. Her eyes darted anxiously toward the home office down the hall, then snapped back to me, the sheer panic finally breaking right through her polished exterior. She understood the precise, crushing weight of that specific vocabulary. Before either of them could formulate a coherent response, the heavy brass lock on the front door clicked loudly. The heavy wood swung open, and the bright, aggressively cheerful voice of my mother-in-law echoed brightly through the foyer. "Hello?" Judith called out, the sound of her sensible low heels clicking briskly against the hardwood. "I brought over those fabric swatches for the dining room chairs we talked about last week." She walked confidently into the kitchen, a canvas tote bag slung casually over her shoulder, a perfectly practiced, warm smile plastered across her face. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the three of us locked in our chilling, silent tableau. She looked at Bennett's pale, sweating face, then at Tessa's trembling hands, and finally at my completely rigid, composed posture. "Oh my," Judith murmured, her smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. "Am I interrupting something important?" She was an incredible actress. If I had not read that unsent text message on the computer, I would have completely believed the performance. I would have thought she was just an innocent, loving mother walking blindly into the catastrophic fallout of her son's horrible life choices. "Not at all, Judith," I said, my voice warming into a dangerously polite, conversational register. "Your timing is actually perfect. Bennett and Tessa were just leaving the premises. We were just having a very brief discussion about the current state of the property." Judith shifted her weight awkwardly, her eyes flicking nervously toward her son. "The property? I am afraid I do not understand." I picked up my coffee mug again, holding it with both hands. "Yes, I am initiating a comprehensive title insurance review on the house starting first thing tomorrow morning. It is just standard procedure when a marriage dissolves. I need to make absolutely sure the deed is secure and completely unencumbered by any outside claims before we begin the formal asset division." The reaction was entirely microscopic, but to a trained fraud investigator, it was as loud and obvious as a distress flare. Bennett just looked confused and deeply devastated, his mind still entirely trapped in the superficial narrative of the affair. He genuinely thought I was just being vindictive about the real estate because my heart was broken. But Judith did not look at Bennett. The very moment the words "title insurance review" left my mouth, Judith's eyes snapped directly across the room to Tessa. It was a sharp, calculating, utterly terrifying look. It was the desperate look of a commanding officer realizing a critical, highly classified flank had just been breached. Tessa met the older woman's gaze, giving a microscopic, trembling shake of her head, a silent, damning confirmation of absolute disaster. In that single, fleeting exchange of glances, the entire power dynamic of the room shifted under my feet. My husband was a fool. He was a vain, financially desperate man who thought he was playing a clever, independent game of deception. He thought he was the mastermind securing his own financial bailout. But watching the silent, panicked communication pass between the luxury broker and the smiling mother-in-law, the final, ugliest truth crystallized perfectly in my mind. Bennett was nothing but a pawn. He was the most visible, expendable piece on the board, easily manipulated by the women around him. He was just the blunt instrument they were using to crack open my vault. The real architect of this nightmare was not the sweating man crying in my kitchen. It was the woman standing in the doorway, clutching a bag of fabric swatches. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, Marisol and I were sitting in the heavily soundproofed conference room of her downtown law firm. We did not waste a single second discussing the emotional collapse of my marriage. We were there to execute a surgical, preemptive strike on their financial infrastructure. Our first move was filing a formal notice of dispute, a lis pendens, with the county records office. This legal maneuver effectively placed a massive, brilliantly glowing warning sign directly over my property deed. It loudly broadcasted to the entire financial world that the ownership of the house was currently under severe legal contest. From that exact second forward, any attempt to record a new lien, execute a transfer of deed, or finalize a mortgage would immediately trigger a hard, impenetrable stop. The house was locked down. By 9:30 in the morning, North Spire Bank took decisive action based on my direct warning from the previous afternoon. Their internal risk management team escalated the file to their highest tier of fraud investigation. The pending home equity line of credit was completely frozen in the system. The regional loan officer who had been carelessly pushing the paperwork through the approval queue was temporarily suspended pending a ruthless internal audit. The bank flagged the forged signature and the irregularly submitted, unverified notary stamp, officially classifying the application as a suspected federal lending crime. We did not stop at the bank. At exactly 10 in the morning, Marisol unleashed the spoliation letters. These were severe, uncompromising legal demands for immediate data preservation, sent simultaneously via certified overnight mail and digitally tracked email to the corporate compliance officers at both Cross and Vale Living and Alder and Reed Realty. The legal language was absolute and terrifying. Both companies were now formally mandated to freeze and preserve their internal servers. They were strictly prohibited from deleting any corporate correspondence, clearing server backups, wiping printer logs, destroying text messages, or altering the digital metadata remotely associated with my property, the 3 neighboring lots, or the shell company they had formed. If Tessa or Bennett panicked and hit the delete key on a single, seemingly insignificant email, they would no longer just be facing civil litigation. They would be committing the crime of intentional destruction of evidence. I knew my own professional flank needed immediate fortification. At noon, I walked into the corner office of my managing director at Vesper Risk Solutions. In the corporate fraud sector, the mere appearance of impropriety is just as lethal to a career as actual guilt. I sat down and laid out a sanitized, heavily redacted, but factually precise version of the unfolding situation. I explicitly declared a potential conflict of interest. Over the past 3 years, Tessa had casually referred a handful of wealthy, high-net-worth clients to our firm for private portfolio risk assessments. By proactively disclosing the incoming, highly volatile litigation against her and my husband, I built an impenetrable firewall around my career. My director thanked me for my absolute transparency, immediately locked my professional files behind a secondary security clearance protocol, and assured me my position, my salary, and my industry reputation remained completely untouchable. I was the investigator, not the liability. The ripple effects of our rapid-fire legal assault hit Bennett first. By Wednesday afternoon, the financial shockwaves began to tear through his architectural renovation business. When North Spire Bank officially flagged the fraudulent loan application, their automated systems triggered a cascading series of alerts across the major commercial credit reporting bureaus. Bennett's existing business credit lines, which I now knew were already stretched to their absolute breaking point, were suddenly subjected to emergency algorithmic reviews. His primary commercial lender saw the massive, outstanding debts to his lumber and electrical suppliers combined directly with the fresh, glowing fraud alert. They panicked. Without a single warning phone call, they completely froze his operating capital account. When Bennett tried to swipe his corporate card to pay a vendor that afternoon, it was harshly declined. He could not make his weekly payroll. He could not buy basic materials for his active job sites. His entire company began to asphyxiate in real time, completely cut off from the artificial financial oxygen he had been living on. Tessa was faring absolutely no better. Alder and Reed Realty was a prestigious, highly conservative brokerage that survived entirely on elite discretion and spotless generational reputations. When their in-house legal compliance department received Marisol's data preservation demand outlining severe allegations of coordinated real estate fraud, title manipulation, and forged financial instruments, they did not hesitate for a single moment. The managing broker called Tessa into his office and quietly, brutally pulled her off her 2 most lucrative, high-profile listings in the northern suburbs. She was stripped of all her active client access and placed on an indefinite, unpaid administrative leave pending the results of their own rigorous internal investigation. Her polished headshot and contact information were immediately scrubbed from the active agent roster on the company website. In the cutthroat, hyper-competitive world of luxury real estate, being suddenly benched and hidden away during the peak spring selling season was an absolute professional death sentence. Her reputation was bleeding out, and she had no way to stop it. While their professional lives rapidly imploded under the weight of my legal filings, I focused on securing the physical architecture of their betrayal. I hired a private, independent digital forensics specialist, a former federal cybercrime contractor who charged an exorbitant hourly rate and was worth every single penny of it. He arrived at my house on Thursday morning carrying a heavy protective case full of specialized data extraction hardware. I stood in the doorway of the home office and watched as he systematically bypassed the passwords and cloned the entire hard drive of the shared desktop computer. He created a mathematically perfect, legally admissible mirror image of the machine, capturing every deleted file, every hidden folder, and every microscopic piece of metadata. He meticulously extracted the internal memory cache directly from the laser printer, permanently mapping the exact creation dates and times of the PDF documents Bennett had maliciously manipulated. We established a flawless, bulletproof chain of custody for every piece of digital evidence in the house. By late Friday evening, the 48-hour eviction window I had mandated was a distant memory. The house was completely empty of his tailored suits, his expensive cologne, and his architectural drafting tubes. The silence in the home was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was clean, sharp, and entirely mine. My phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island. It was a call from a cheap, extended-stay motel located way out by the interstate highway. Bennett had finally broken the silence. "Avery, please," Bennett begged the moment I answered the call. His voice was completely stripped of all its former arrogant warmth and smooth confidence. He was reduced to a hollow, exhausted, trembling rasp. "My business bank accounts are completely locked down. My subcontractors are actively threatening to sue me for breach of contract. Tessa is absolutely terrified she's going to lose her broker license permanently. You have made your point. I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. Can we please just sit down with a neutral mediator and figure out how to untangle this marriage without burning everything we have built to the ground?" I stood perfectly still, looking out at the clean, quiet hallway, my eyes resting briefly on the spot at the bottom of the staircase where the champagne Sandals had been sitting just a few days ago. I kept my voice steady. I did not need to scream, cry, or throw insults. The power I held did not come from volume. It came from certainty and proof. "We are not untangling a marriage, Bennett," I told him, my words sharp, measured, and lethally calm. "You unilaterally dissolved the marriage the exact moment you decided to forge my signature on federal banking documents. I am dismantling a coordinated criminal enterprise, and I will not stop until the entire structure you built is reduced to dust." I disconnected the call, placed the phone face down on the cool marble, and walked away. I met my younger brother, Rowan Barnes, at a dim, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city. As a senior civil infrastructure engineer for the city of Charlotte, Rowan lived in a world of concrete pours, zoning variances, and municipal blueprints. He slid into the vinyl booth opposite me, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He ordered a black coffee, wrapping his large, calloused hands around the ceramic mug before finally meeting my eyes. "I should have said something," Rowan started, his voice heavy with guilt. "When you texted me that name last night, it made me sick to my stomach." "Juniper Crest Holdings," I stated evenly. "When did you hear it?" Rowan sighed, staring down at the Formica table. "About 3 weeks ago, I was at a municipal planning mixer downtown. A couple of commercial developers were having a few too many drinks, bragging about a shadow entity that was quietly scooping up distressed parcels in the South End corridor. They name-dropped Juniper Crest. I did not think much of it until the conversation shifted to the new transit initiative." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "The light rail extension is not public yet, Avery. It is buried in committee revisions, but the whispers are incredibly loud among the heavy hitters. The proposed route runs exactly 2 blocks behind your street." I nodded, processing the confirmation of my theory. "They are assembling the block for a high-density commercial buyout." Rowan rubbed the back of his neck. "There is more." I did not want to believe it. But looking back, I was an idiot. Think back to the 4th of July barbecue at your house last summer. Do you remember when your mother-in-law cornered me by the grill? The memory surfaced sharply. Judith Cross, holding a crystal glass of iced tea, chatting amicably with my brother while Bennett and I were busy setting up lawn games in the backyard. She asked me a very specific, very strange set of questions. Rowan continued. She started asking about urban density laws. Then she hypothetically asked how much a standard residential block in your specific neighborhood would increase in value if someone managed to buy up 4 contiguous lots and get them rezoned for commercial transit use. I told her the multiplier would be astronomical, easily 5 to 10 times the current residential appraisal. "And you kept this to yourself?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "It was a casual conversation over hot dogs," Rowan pleaded defensively. She framed it as an idle curiosity about real estate trends. "If I had come to you and said your mother-in-law was secretly plotting to bulldoze your house based on a 5-minute chat at a cookout, you would have thought I was losing my mind. I did not want to light a match in your marriage without actual proof." I could not blame him. Judith was a master of the invisible maneuver. "Why my house specifically?" "Rowan, Tessa already secured the 3 houses adjacent to mine. Why do they need my property to make the deal work?" Rowan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded, scaled printout of my neighborhood's plat map. He smoothed it out on the table and tapped a heavy finger directly onto the square representing my home. "Because of the alley," he explained, tracing a faded gray line that bordered the rear of my property. "The 3 lots Tessa bought are landlocked by the main arterial road on the front and private property on the sides. The City Zoning Commission requires any new high-density commercial structure to have dedicated, separate rear access for commercial waste management and delivery vehicles. Your house sits on the only corner lot that touches the municipal alleyway." I stared at the map. The geometry of their greed was perfectly laid out before me. "Without your specific parcel," Rowan concluded, "those other 3 lots are completely useless for a mega development. The city will deny the commercial zoning permit. Your house is the bottleneck. It is the keystone. Whoever controls your deed controls the entire multi-million-dollar transit hub project." It made terrifying sense. Judith had identified the gold mine. She knew her son was married to the woman sitting on the literal gateway to a fortune. "There is one last thing," Rowan said softly, his expression turning grim. "Since you told me about the forged loan application, I made some calls to a few commercial bond underwriters I know in the construction sector. Avery, Bennett's financial situation is not just bad. It is a catastrophic, unrecoverable crater." He slid a piece of notebook paper across the table. It contained a list of numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. "Bennett owes his primary lenders and mezzanine investors upwards of $3 million, Rowan whispered. "He took on massive commercial bridge loans for those boutique renovations, and when the supply chain choked last year, his carrying costs buried him. He is facing total bankruptcy, asset seizure, and potentially criminal fraud charges from his own investors if he does not inject a massive amount of capital into his holding accounts by the end of this fiscal quarter." I sat back against the rigid vinyl seat, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with a deafening, final click. Bennett was not just trying to steal a little equity to float his business. He was a drowning man looking at a 10-year prison sentence. The land deal was his singular desperate exit strategy. Selling the assembled block to the transit developers would generate enough cash to wipe out his $3 million debt, with plenty left over for Tessa and his mother. But there was a major obstacle in their path. I owned half the house. Worse, I was a seasoned fraud investigator who managed the household finances with an iron grip. If Bennett simply asked me to sell the house, I would demand appraisals, review the market trends, and inevitably discover the impending light rail expansion. I would realize the true commercial value of our land. I would never agree to a rapid, quiet, undervalued sale to a shell company. They needed me gone, and they needed me to leave the house behind without asking any questions. The sheer psychological cruelty of their strategy washed over me, a dark, freezing wave. The affair with Tessa Wren was never a reckless crime of passion. The champagne sandals left at the bottom of the stairs, the half-empty wine glasses deliberately placed on the counter, the hushed laughter designed to carry down the hallway. It was all a meticulously choreographed stage play. Sex was nothing but the bait. The real estate was the ultimate target. Judith and Bennett had weaponized his infidelity. They manufactured an emotionally devastating betrayal, intending to use my own broken heart as a crowbar to pry me out of my home. They calculated that a deeply humiliated, grieving wife would be entirely consumed by the trauma of the affair. They expected me to hire a divorce attorney, demand a swift dissolution of the marriage, and sign a quitclaim deed to wash my hands of the marital residence just to escape the agonizing memories of the bed they had defiled. My pain was supposed to be their ultimate distraction. My shame was supposed to be the very tool they used to blindfold me while they robbed me blind. They thought they could break my spirit so thoroughly that I would just walk away, leaving the crown jewel of their real estate empire sitting perfectly in their palms. I looked down at the cold, black coffee in front of me. I had spent my entire adult life hunting down corporate thieves who hid behind complex spreadsheets and offshore accounts. But this was an entirely different breed of monster. This was a family that had decided to butcher my soul to balance their checkbook. "Are you okay?" Rowan asked, his voice thick with concern. I picked up the plat map, folding it carefully and sliding it into my leather bag. The lingering sting of a failed marriage was completely gone, incinerated by the cold, brilliant fire of absolute clarity. "I am perfectly fine," I told my brother, and for the first time in days, it was the absolute truth. They built their entire plan on the assumption that I would shatter. Now, they are going to learn what happens when I strike back. They did not retreat. When cornered, desperate people do not surrender. They simply change their weapons. Bennett hired a notoriously aggressive divorce litigator, a man whose entire reputation was built on burying opposing spouses in frivolous injunctions and character assassinations. Less than 48 hours after I forced Bennett out of the house, Marisol received a blistering cease and desist letter. The document formally accused me of executing an illegal invasion of my husband's digital privacy. The lawyer claimed my access to the home network logs and the desktop computer constituted unauthorized cyber surveillance, attempting to reframe my forensic discoveries as the unhinged, paranoid actions of a deeply unstable woman. Simultaneously, Tessa launched a quiet, lethal psychological campaign through our shared social circles. Charlotte's high-end residential market is a small, tightly connected world, and Tessa knew exactly how to manipulate its whisper network. She began leaking a carefully sanitized narrative to mutual acquaintances, country club members, and local business owners. She painted a picture of me as a tragic, overworked corporate drone who had finally snapped under the immense pressure of my job. The story she seeded was that my marriage had been dead for years, and upon discovering a simple, unfortunate emotional affair, I suffered a complete nervous breakdown. Tessa told people I was inventing wild financial conspiracies and fabricating real estate plots simply to exact a vicious, irrational revenge. Then came the calculated olive branch from Judith. It arrived via a private courier on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, sealed in a heavy cream-colored envelope. It was a formal settlement proposal, drafted to look incredibly generous to a casual observer. Judith offered to facilitate a quiet, completely private buyout of my equity in the house. She proposed paying me a 20% premium over the current market appraisal, provided I immediately sign a temporary residency agreement. The terms required me to quietly vacate the premises within 30 days and agree to list the property for a private sale immediately after the divorce was finalized. It was a brilliantly disguised trap. If I signed it, I would willingly hand them the keystone to their multi-million-dollar transit hub development, legally absolving them of their fraud while believing I had won a favorable settlement. I did not even bother drafting a counteroffer. I handed the heavy cream paper back to Marisol and instructed her to send a single, uncompromising sentence to their legal team. All future communication must be routed exclusively through legal counsel, and the property remains strictly off the market. But their combined assault was beginning to take a severe toll on my daily life. The social isolation crept in like a freezing fog. Neighbors I had hosted for summer barbecues and holiday parties suddenly avoided making eye contact when I pulled into my driveway. Women I had considered casual friends suddenly took days to return a simple text message, their replies clipped and painfully polite. When I walked into my usual neighborhood coffee shop, the lively chatter would abruptly drop in volume, replaced by sideways, assessing glances. They were looking at me not with sympathy, but with deep,
uncomfortable caution. They had heard Tessa's whispers. They genuinely wondered if I was the villain of my own life, a bitter, paranoid woman trying to destroy her husband over a broken heart. Sitting alone at a small cafe table, staring into a black coffee, I realized a terrifying truth. The collective ostracization of my community, the sudden loss of my social standing, actually hurt more than the initial sight of those champagne sandals. The betrayal of a husband is a singular wound. The quiet, polite rejection of an entire community is a suffocation. Then, just as I was bracing myself against the social chill, Bennett's aggressive attorney delivered a counterstrike that nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. Marisol called me into her office on a Friday morning. The heavy oak door was shut tight, and she was not smiling. She pushed a manila folder across her expansive glass desk. "They filed an emergency response to our dispute with the bank," Marisol said, her voice tight with genuine concern. "Avery, you need to look at this." I opened the folder. Inside was a high-resolution color copy of a single document page. It was an addendum to the home equity line of credit application. My signature was perfectly rendered at the bottom, exactly matching the charity form Bennett had digitally lifted. But that was not the part that hit me hardest. Pressed firmly next to the ink of my forged name was a physical, embossed stamp. It was a legitimate, registered state notary seal, accompanied by a wet ink signature of a licensed notary public. The digital forgery I could easily prove. A physical notary seal, legally swearing that an official of the state had physically witnessed me sign the document, elevated the situation from a suspicious file to a federally binding contract. How did they get a real notary to stamp a forged page? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Read Bennett's sworn affidavit attached to the back," Marisol instructed grimly. I flipped the page. Bennett had submitted a legally binding statement under penalty of perjury. In it, he claimed that I had absolutely known about the home equity loan and had willingly signed the final authorization page in person. He provided a highly specific, terrifyingly plausible alibi. He stated that I had signed the document during the annual Children's Hospital charity brunch, an event we had attended together exactly 1 month ago. Bennett's affidavit painted a vivid, humiliating picture. He claimed I had consumed 4 heavy glasses of vintage champagne during the mid-morning event. He stated that while we were sitting at our sponsored table, surrounded by wealthy donors, he had slipped the addendum onto a clipboard and handed it to me. According to his sworn statement, I was slightly inebriated, laughing with the other guests, and hastily scribbled my name on the paper without bothering to read the fine print, explicitly telling him to just handle the finances. He even provided the name of the mobile notary, claiming she was a guest at a neighboring table who had done him a quick professional favor. It was a masterful, evil piece of gaslighting. He was using a real, documented social event to deliberately blur the lines of my own memory. He was forcing the legal system to look at a purportedly tipsy, careless wife who was now simply experiencing buyer's remorse and crying fraud. For one agonizing minute, standing in Marisol's office, a wave of profound doubt washed over me. Had I drank that much? Had he slid a clipboard in front of me while I was distracted by the auctioneer? The human memory is incredibly fragile, highly susceptible to suggestion and stress. If they took this to a civil judge, the court would look at the raised seal, read the plausible narrative of a distracted, champagne-soaked brunch, and rule in his favor. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and slammed the steel doors of my mental vault shut on the panic. I am a senior corporate fraud investigator. I do not rely on fragile memories, and I certainly do not let guilty men rewrite my reality. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Marisol. "Do not file a single response yet," I told her, my tone dropping into the cold, mechanical cadence of my profession. "Give me 24 hours. I left the law firm and drove straight home. I walked into my office, locked the door, and opened my laptop. I was not going to argue with Bennett's attorney in a courtroom. I was going to surgically dissect his manufactured reality. I started with the transportation. I logged into my rideshare application account and pulled the digital receipt from the day of the brunch.
The log showed the vehicle picked us up at exactly 10:15 in the morning and dropped us back at our house at 2:30 in the afternoon. I had the absolute chronological boundaries of the event. Next, I pulled my personal credit card statements. Bennett claimed I drank 4 glasses of vintage champagne. But I knew the charity event only provided 1 complimentary glass of cheap Prosecco at the door. All premium alcohol was sold at a cash bar to raise additional funds. I found the itemized charge from the hotel's catering service. It was for $12, exactly enough for 2 sparkling waters. I had absolute financial proof of my sobriety. Then, I went after the visual timeline. Charity galas are the most heavily documented social events on Earth. I tracked down the website of the professional photography company hired for the brunch. I paid a $300 rush fee to access the complete, unedited digital gallery of over 2,000 raw images. I sat in the dark for 6 hours, scrutinizing every single photograph, analyzing timestamps, background angles, and table arrangements. I was building a minute-by-minute, indisputable forensic reconstruction of that afternoon, determined to prove that the clipboard, the signature, and the mobile notary were nothing but a desperate, elaborate lie. I sent the text message from a completely untraceable burner phone I had purchased with cash at a local pharmacy. The message contained only a time, a location, and a single demand. 3 o'clock this afternoon. The Oak Lounge at the Grand Hotel, no lawyers, just us. If you tell Bennett, the offer is completely off the table. I arrived 30 minutes early. The Oak Lounge was a dark, cavernous space lined with heavy mahogany panels and sound-absorbing velvet curtains. It was the kind of place where old money went to have quiet, undocumented conversations. I chose a small, circular table tucked securely into a secluded corner alcove. I ordered a glass of sparkling water. I opened my leather handbag, unlocked my smartphone, activated the high-definition voice memo application, and slipped the device back inside, leaving the golden clasp perfectly unfastened to expose the microphone. Exactly at 3 o'clock, Tessa Wren walked through the heavy brass doors. She wore her confidence like a tailored suit of armor. Her designer trench coat was draped perfectly over her shoulders, and her chin was tilted upward in a posture of arrogant superiority. She scanned the room, spotted me in the shadows, and glided over with the predatory grace of someone who firmly believed she had already won the war. She slid into the velvet chair across from me and signaled the waiter for a dry martini. I let my shoulders slump. I actively drained the sharp, investigative focus from my eyes, replacing it with the dull, hollow stare of a deeply broken woman. I needed her to believe that the social isolation, the forged notary document, and the relentless legal pressure had finally cracked my foundation. I cannot fight a war on 3 different fronts, Tessa, I said, keeping my voice low and weary. The vicious whispers at the country club, the endless attorney fees, the sheer suffocating humiliation of this entire ordeal. I am completely exhausted. I just want a clean break. Tessa's posture relaxed instantly. The tight defensive tension melted away from her neck. She took a slow, elegant sip of her cocktail, tasting the sweet flavor of total victory. She thought she had successfully starved me out of my own life. I knew you would eventually see reason, Tessa replied smoothly, her voice dripping with practiced, condescending empathy. This never had to be a bloodbath. Judith always said it would just take a little bit of time and pressure to make you see the reality of the situation. Judith seems to know exactly how I operate, I murmured softly, tracing the rim of my water glass with a trembling finger. Tessa leaned forward, entirely too comfortable, completely eager to boast about their strategic brilliance. She is an incredibly pragmatic woman. She told Bennett from the very beginning that the house would become emotionally compromised for you the exact moment you found out about our arrangement. She said, no proud woman wants to sleep under the same roof where her husband brought his lover. She knew you would be desperate to sell the property and walk away, just to escape the memories. A cold thrill shot straight down my spine. The psychological trap had just snapped shut. She had just admitted, out loud and on a crystal-clear digital recording, that the affair was not a mistake of passion. It was a calculated, premeditated mechanism designed by my mother-in-law to force the rapid sale of a highly valuable asset.
I kept my facial expression perfectly blank, swallowing the triumphant smile threatening to break across my lips. Pragmatic is certainly one word for it, I replied quietly. But I am genuinely curious. Tessa,
Did Bennett happen to be pragmatic when he told you the actual bottom-line number on his commercial debts? Tessa frowned slightly, a tiny, uncomfortable ripple disrupting her serene composure. Every developer carries short-term bridge loans. It is the standard cost of doing business in luxury real estate. It is a few $100,000. Once we close the land assembly and flip the entire block to the Municipal Transit Authority, the payout will cover his arrears 10 times over. I let out a soft, hollow laugh. I leaned closer across the table, dropping my voice into a conspiratorial, chilling whisper. He owes his mezzanine lenders over $3 million. His primary business accounts are completely frozen. The general contractors are actively preparing to file mechanics liens on every single one of his active job sites by the end of the month. The color completely drained from Tessa's perfectly bronzed face. She stared at me, her mouth parting in silent horror. She was a seasoned real estate broker. She knew exactly what that catastrophic level of default meant. It meant their shell company was dead on arrival. It meant she had securely hitched her own professional wagon to a violently sinking ship. "That is entirely impossible," she hissed, her arrogant facade crumbling into genuine panic. He told me the cash flow was tight, but he explicitly said he was patching the holes with the change order margins from the Highland Park renovation. I froze internally. I had not looked into his active client billing records. I slowly drew the conversation along, giving her just enough room to stumble over her own words. "You mean the structural upgrades?" I asked innocently, pretending to be confused. Tessa, now desperate to prove she understood the financial architecture of his business, spilled the entire, devastating secret. "No," she snapped defensively. "The phantom billing. He has been systematically inflating the change order costs on his luxury renovations for the past 6 months. He is billing wealthy clients for imported Italian marble and secretly substituting it with domestic surplus. He is charging for heavy load-bearing steel reinforcements that his structural engineers never actually installed. He told me he was skimming off the top of those massive projects to keep his operational capital afloat until our transit deal finally closed." My heart hammered a vicious rhythm against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly motionless on the wooden table. Bennett was not just defrauding federal banks and forging his wife's signature. He was actively committing severe civil fraud against his own high-net-worth clients, deliberately jeopardizing the structural integrity of their homes to steal their money. And Tessa knew all about it. She was entirely complicit in the cover-up. Tessa suddenly realized she had said entirely too much. She looked around the quiet, dimly lit lounge, her eyes wide and frantic, suddenly resembling a cornered animal realizing the exit is blocked. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the polished mahogany wood. "Listen to me," Tessa pleaded, her voice dropping into a desperate, hurried pitch. "Bennett is a total fool. He lied to me just like he lied to you. I am absolutely not going down for his financial incompetence and his fraudulent billing. You are the registered managing partner of the shell company," I reminded her coldly. "You are already deeply buried in it." "Not if you drop the legal dispute with the bank," she countered immediately, her raw survival instinct completely overriding any lingering loyalty to my husband. "If you officially withdraw the forgery allegation and walk away from the property today, I will make it extremely worth your while. This is completely independent of Judith's settlement offer. I have my own private offshore accounts, untraceable funds. I will personally wire you $300,000 by tomorrow morning. You take my cash. You take whatever Judith is offering for the house, and you disappear entirely. We both walk away from Bennett's sinking ship and let him drown alone." I looked at her. I really looked at her. She was terrified, inherently greedy, and fundamentally weak. She had just explicitly offered me a massive, illegal monetary bribe to formally cover up a federal banking forgery, a commercial real estate conspiracy, and ongoing contractor fraud. And my phone, sitting quietly in the darkness of my leather bag, was capturing every single desperate, damning syllable. I let a soft, seemingly defeated sigh escape my lips. I picked up my purse, ensuring the bag stayed upright, and slipped the heavy leather strap over my shoulder. "I will have Marisol draft the withdrawal paperwork this evening," I lied smoothly, offering her a tired, resigned nod. "Have your international routing numbers ready by tomorrow morning." Tessa sagged back against the plush velvet chair. A massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over her sharp features. She took a long, triumphant sip of her martini, firmly believing she had just successfully outmaneuvered the investigator. She truly thought she had simply purchased her own freedom. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the final, explosive piece of ammunition I needed to obliterate their entire world. I turned my back on her and walked out of the quiet lounge, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the polished marble floor. The preliminary hearing took place on a damp Tuesday morning inside a windowless civil courtroom on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. The air inside the room was stale, heavily overconditioned, and suffocatingly tense. Bennett sat 2 tables away from me, his posture rigid, his face pale but aggressively set. He had dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, playing the part of the embattled, wronged husband to absolute perfection. Beside him sat his bulldog of a divorce litigator, a man who moved with the arrogant swagger of someone who believed paper always defeated truth. Within the first 15 minutes of the hearing, I felt the terrifying, heavy reality of the civil justice system closing in around my throat. Bennett's attorney stood before the judge, brandishing the high-resolution copy of the home equity addendum. He did not yell. He did not need to. He simply let the bureaucratic weight of the document do the executioner's work for him. He pointed directly to the raised, embossed seal pressed into the heavy paper and the wet ink signature of the licensed state notary public. He eloquently argued that my allegations of digital forgery were nothing more than the vindictive, retaliatory fantasies of a scorned woman suffering from a broken heart. According to him, the state had legally authenticated my presence and my consent. I glanced sideways at Marisol, for the very first time since I had hired her. My fiercely confident attorney looked visibly constrained. She shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her jaw tight. In civil court, a judge looks first at the paper, not at the intuition of a private investigator. A registered notary stamp is the ultimate legal shield. Unless we could definitively prove the stamp itself was stolen or fabricated, the court was legally bound to accept the document at face value. Bennett was going to win. He was going to use the court's reliance on protocol to validate a federal crime and walk away with the keys to the entire transit hub fortune. I looked down at the physical copy of the disputed application resting on our defense table. Panic would not help me, so I pushed it aside. I did what I have done for 10 years. I stopped looking at the terrifying narrative and started looking at the microscopic, boring data. I traced my eyes past the flawless digital copy of my signature. I looked past the imposing circular notary stamp. I forced my vision down to the absolute bottom margin of the page, scanning the tiny, standardized, boilerplate text that banks use to catalog their infinite piles of administrative forms. My eyes locked onto a tiny string of alphanumeric characters, printed in a pale 6-point font at the bottom right corner. I leaned closer, my breath catching sharply in my chest. I read the tiny print again. It was a document control code. It read, in plain English, revision date the 1st of June. I reached out and grabbed Marisol by the wrist, my grip tight enough to make her flinch. I pulled her close, pointing my index finger directly at the microscopic text. The charity brunch where Bennett swore under penalty of perjury that I signed this document took place on the 17th of April, I whispered, my voice completely steady, a cold thrill of absolute adrenaline flooding my veins. This specific page template, this exact revision of the bank's liability addendum, was not published by their legal department until the 1st of June. That is exactly 6 weeks after the day he claims he handed it to me on a clipboard. Marisol stared at the tiny text, her eyes widening as the lethal implication of the dates registered in her mind. The suffocating pressure in the room vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of an imminent kill. We had the digital forensics report sitting right in our primary evidence binder. I flipped to page 42. My independent cyber expert had mapped the metadata of the PDF template Bennett had manipulated on our home desktop. The creation date of the file matched the form revision code perfectly. It was physically impossible for me to have signed a piece of paper in mid-April that simply did not exist anywhere on Earth until early June. But I did not just want to prove Bennett was lying. I wanted to completely demolish his entire manufactured reality. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy 8x10 photograph Rowan had rush printed for me late last night. He had spent hours scouring the digital galleries of the charity brunch, hunting for any anomaly, and he had found a masterpiece. I slid the photograph across the table to Marisol. It was a candid shot of me standing near the silent auction tables on the exact afternoon in question. I was holding a small glass of sparkling water in my left hand. My right hand, my dominant writing hand, was strapped tightly into a rigid black orthopedic wrist brace secured with 3 thick Velcro straps. I had suffered a minor sprain moving a heavy box of files at the office 2 days prior to the event. "Look at the signature on the forged document," I told Marisol, my voice dropping into a lethal, surgical cadence. "It is a long, fluid, continuous loop. It requires complete flexibility of the wrist. In that photograph, my wrist is completely immobilized. I could not even hold a pen that day, let alone execute a flawless, sweeping signature while drinking champagne." Marisol did not smile, but her eyes hardened into polished obsidian. She stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. She did not ask the judge for a recess. She asked for immediate permission to enter newly subpoenaed evidence into the official record. Bennett's lawyer scoffed, but the judge granted the motion. Marisol walked to the center of the room. She did not start with the dates or the photograph. She started with the notary. "Your Honor," Marisol began, her voice ringing with absolute, chilling clarity. Opposing counsel relies heavily on the physical seal of a mobile notary to authenticate this document. However, under a direct subpoena executed yesterday afternoon, we obtained the official, state-mandated logbook for that specific notary public. Bennett shifted in his chair. The aggressive posture began to melt off his shoulders. "The logbook confirms that the notary was nowhere near the charity brunch on the 17th of April," Marisol continued, raising a certified transcript into the air. "In fact, during an emergency sworn deposition conducted late last night under the threat of losing her state commission, the notary confessed. She admitted that she never met my client. She never witnessed my client sign anything. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute, I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above us." "The notary testified," Marisol said, turning slowly to look directly at Bennett's pale, sweating face, "that on the 3rd of June, a stack of pre-signed documents was brought directly to her private office by a woman she has done frequent, quiet business with in the past. An executive assistant who works exclusively for Mr. Cross's mother, Judith Cross. The notary was paid a premium cash fee to stamp a document that had already been manipulated. Swapping the final page into a pre-approved loan packet, Bennett's attorney shot up from his chair, frantically objecting, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. But the artery was already severed. Marisol ignored him completely. Walking over to the judge's bench and laying down the forensic metadata report, the macro photograph of the document revision code, and the high-resolution picture of my immobilized wrist. They forged a signature in April on a document that was not printed until June, and bribed a state official to cover their tracks. Marisol concluded coldly. "This is not a dispute over a marital asset. Your Honor, this is a coordinated, multi-party conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, identity theft, and perjury." I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I watched Bennett's jaw tremble. I watched his aggressive, highly paid lawyer slowly sit back down, staring at the evidence with the hollow, defeated look of a man realizing his client had just dragged him into a massive federal crime. In the span of exactly 45 minutes, the entire architecture of their trap completely collapsed. The scandal they had so carefully designed to humiliate me, to isolate me, and to quietly steal my home had just violently inverted. They were no longer fighting a broken, weeping wife in a civil dispute. They were now staring directly down the barrel of a multi-agency criminal investigation. The final mediation was not held in a cramped courthouse. It was held in the expansive, glass-walled boardroom of a neutral arbitration firm on the 50th floor of a downtown high-rise. Outside, the city of Charlotte sprawled under a clear, pale blue sky. Inside, the temperature was set to a freezing 64 degrees. Bennett sat across from me, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the man I had married. His aggressive litigator was now entirely silent, reduced to a glorified witness. Next to them sat Tessa, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, flanked by her newly retained criminal defense attorney. And at the far end of the long mahogany table, sitting perfectly upright with her hands neatly folded, was Judith. She still wore her mask of maternal concern, though the edges were beginning to fray. Marisol did not raise her voice. She did not pace the room. She simply opened a thick black leather binder and began to deal the cards of their destruction. She laid out the entire, uninterrupted sequence of events. She detailed the synchronized schedule of the affair. She presented the forged home equity application alongside the perjured notary log. She mapped out the shell company's quiet acquisition of the 3 neighboring lots. Finally, she produced the forensic accounting of Bennett's inflated construction invoices. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. The mediator, a retired federal judge, stared at the documents with grim, absolute comprehension. When Marisol finished, she looked directly at Tessa. She outlined the impending civil liabilities, the absolute certainty of the real estate commission revoking her broker license, and the criminal referrals being prepared for the district attorney regarding the forged bank documents. Self-preservation is a powerful, ugly instinct. Tessa cracked. She did not just confess. She aggressively turned state's evidence right there at the table. Her attorney slid a manila envelope across the polished wood. Inside were printed transcripts of encrypted text messages, secure voice notes, and the original, unredacted draft of the operating agreement for the shell company. "I am not going to federal prison for a family of sociopaths," Tessa stated, her voice shaking but venomous. "I was just the broker." Judith orchestrated the entire land assembly. She funneled the initial deposit money from her late husband's trust. Tessa tapped her manicured finger against the printed operating agreement. The document clearly showed that while Bennett and Tessa were listed as managing partners, an anonymous proxy holding 95% of the voting rights and equity was directly controlled by Judith Cross. I watched Bennett as the reality of the document slowly registered in his mind. He stared at the signature line, his eyes wide and vacant. For months, he had operated under the delusion that he was a brilliant, rogue architect executing a daring financial maneuver to save his failing business. He thought he was partners with his mother and his lover. But looking at the brutal, unfeeling legal text, the truth finally crushed him. He was never the mastermind. He was just the easiest, most disposable tool in his mother's toolkit. Judith had positioned him to take the absolute brunt of the federal forgery charges while she remained insulated behind corporate firewalls, ready to reap the massive commercial transit payout. Bennett slowly turned his head to look at his mother. The betrayal on his face was absolute, a perfect, agonizing mirror of what I had felt standing in my own foyer weeks ago. Judith did not look back at him. She stared straight ahead, her lips pressed into a thin, furious, bloodless line. Realizing her invisible empire had just been dragged violently into the light. The collapse of their world was rapid, total, and utterly merciless. Within 14 days, the commercial developers driving the Shadow Transit project caught wind of the title dispute and the impending fraud investigations. They instantly severed all ties. refusing to touch the toxic, legally radioactive parcels. The shell company immediately defaulted on the short-term loans used to purchase the neighboring properties. Without the anticipated commercial buyout, Bennett's architectural firm violently imploded. The revelation of his phantom billing practices sparked a frenzy of audits from his former clients. Class action lawsuits were filed within the month. His commercial lenders seized his remaining assets, and he was forced into a devastating, highly publicized Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Tessa faced the exact professional execution she had feared. The State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her broker license for gross ethical violations and complicity in mortgage fraud. She became entirely toxic in the luxury housing market. Her carefully cultivated reputation reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at industry networking events. As for the forged documents and the perjured notary, Marisol handed our entire forensic dossier over to the state attorney general. The criminal machinery grinds slowly, but it grinds exceedingly fine. I walked away with the only thing that actually mattered. I kept the house. Through a brutally swift divorce settlement, I secured the absolute, unencumbered deed to the property, legally barring Bennett and his mother from ever laying a single claim to the land. 8 months later, the Municipal Planning Commission officially announced the new light rail extension on the evening news. The final, approved transit map was broadcasted across the city. The red line running exactly down the alleyway behind my property. Overnight, the value of my corner lot skyrocketed by nearly 400%. I was flooded with frantic, unsolicited offers from commercial developers holding blank checks, but I did not sell, not yet. I was the sole owner of the Keystone, and I was going to dictate the terms on my own timeline. Before I entertained a single commercial bid, I hired a private contracting crew. I gave them one specific, highly detailed work order. I had them completely demolish the custom oak staircase in the center of my home. They tore out the heavy wooden banisters. They ripped up the vintage Persian runner where the damp footprints had been left. They stripped the structure down to the absolute bare studs. I replaced it with floating treads of polished concrete and thick, minimalist panels of tempered glass. I installed brilliant, recessed lighting along the baseboards, illuminating every single inch of the entryway. I did not rebuild the staircase to erase the memory of what happened there. I rebuilt it to fundamentally change the nature of the space. I wanted to transform the exact site of my deepest humiliation into a permanent, physical monument to my own absolute control. On the evening the renovations were finally completed, I stood alone in the center of the foyer. The house was completely silent, bathed in a clean, sharp, brilliant white light. I looked at the spot on the floor where I had first seen those champagne stilettos. They had plotted against me with mechanical precision. They had calculated my emotional fragility. They had banked heavily on my shock, my tears, and my inevitable retreat. They had planned for every possible reaction a heartbroken wife might have. But standing there in the bright, echoing hall, I smiled. They had accounted for everything except the fundamental nature of the woman they were trying to break. They never calculated that instead of asking why he did not love me anymore, I would ask the one question capable of destroying them all. Why do you need my house so badly? Thank you for listening to my story today.